3. Town of the Caged Bird. The hunter drove down the dirt road, looking for a marketplace or a general store in which to sell his wares. The dirt road connected all the myriad buildings, facilitating easy travel between them, but the hunter kept getting distracted by the large building in the middle of town that was at least a couple stories taller than all the others. There was a bell tower on top of it, the bronze bell glowing as it reflected the sunlight. He stopped his car and looked up in marvel at the grand building. However, that was when he noticed something else strange and alarming. Beyond the building, on the horizon, was a mountain range, towering over the town, which is normal enough, but now looking upwards he saw smoke billowing from the peak of the closest mountain. The smoke trail emerging from the peak and into the sky like that of a gray cloud. The hunter stifled a shudder, wondering what danger the smoking mountain peak represented. He knew instinctively, though, that it only held negative consequences. He was about to return to driving when a loud sound began to ring out. He almost jumped straight into the air out of surprise, but his sudden anxiety froze him in his place. He laughed as he realized it was only the bell ringing high above. He turned and looked back up at it, the shining bell swinging from one side to the other. Before the hunter realized he was surrounded by a crowd. People from all over the town were passing him in order to enter the building in front of him. One of the people stopped to greet him, a man with a perplexed look on his face. "Hi there, are you a traveler?" The man asked, and without stopping for an answer, You seem to have gotten here just in time. You should come listen to the sermon inside. It is sure to be good, especially considering the event to take place on the dawn of tomorrow. Come on." The man motioned him forward. "There'll be food and refreshment. With a stranger present, the talk is sure to be more lively." The hunter thought for just a brief moment before nodding in acquiescence. He could use the rest, and he will see what this town is all about in the meantime. Everything about the town seemed to revolve around this large building in the center, at least socially. Of course, he'd have no regrets with a hasty exit after seeing the sermon. He still did not like the look of the smoke trailing off of that mountain. Once inside the large building, he was seated in the aisles, with all the rest of the town. In front of all the seats, raised above the rest of them and centering all their view, was the podium, and the gray-haired man standing behind it. He was wearing the same plain clothes as the rest of the people in the audience, besides a tall hat and a sash hanging over the shoulder, which designated him as the leading spokesperson in the room, the one to be listened to. The older man saw the hunter, and for a moment looked surprised by the new face, but he met his glance and gave the hunter a nod and smile. The gentle man softly addresses a group to his side, too quiet for the hunter to make out what he was saying. However, it soon became apparent what it was. The group beside him were gathering bread and water, refreshments to be passed out amongst all those gathered. Once all of this passed out, the group returned to sitting just like the rest of those gathered, and the room knew that it was time to quiet down, in respect for the man in front, who began to speak. "To welcome our guests, let's start our sermon as far back as we are able to tell, on how the earth and life on it were created. There was the moon and the sun, the two looking about themselves in an empty sky. Laying before the moon there was an infinity and night. Laying beyond the sun there was another infinity and night. Time stretching forever onwards before and beyond where they stood. However, between the moon and the sun stood a mass, a formless wavering ball. Unlike the moon and the sun, it held no life, it was silent. "Let's see if we can shape it then," suggested the moon. "Yeah, let's, if it would pass the time," the sun agreed. And so they gave shape to that formless mass. The moon gave order to the formless mass, the seas were given shape, dictated by the tides. The sun dried parts of it out, molding the land. Where the seas and the land met, mountains emerged, valleys created, and also the rivers that ran through them. The hunter felt drowsy. Listening to this story, he leaned back in his seat and stretched his legs. That much would not be seen as rude, would it? He was still listening intently. The land was still burning from the sun's touch, and the seas frothing from the churning, the shaping of the moon. The first tide, the first meeting of the land and the sea, still filled with the energy of the sun and moon shaping, is where life began. The frothy water crashing into the red-hot land led to some popping off the ground due to the heat, like oil popping out of a pan. This gave rise to the sylphs, and with their wings they still continue to fly to this day, their domain being the air. Left boiling, sizzling on the land with the salamanders, who still have an affinity towards heat, their domain being fire, and the lava springs deep beneath the earth. This was the first wave, so the sylphs and the salamanders hold more of the Creator's magic than those created from the following wave. The next wave that hit the now cooling land gave form to men, our race whose domain is the land, the earth. When this tide returned to the sea, it brought forth the undine. Their domain is that of the sea, the rivers. At this point land had cooled. The sea had lost much of the magic that the moon and sun had imbued within it. Therefore, the creatures created by the next few waves do not have the intelligence that the first four do. They lack self-awareness, or the language abilities of the sylph, salamanders, humans, and undines. The tides bringing animals onto the land, and carrying fish back into the sea. The hunter was nodding. He had never gave much attention to religion, so it's not like the story was boring to him. He was just feeling tired. He shifted in his seat. Over time, all of the races, the humans, the sylph with their wings, the burning salamanders, and the undine of the ocean, noticed that in seasons when the sun was shining in its brightest, and the weather was warm, that more crops were produced, and times were good. But when the days were shorter, when the sunlight shone less upon the land and seas, and the weather was cold, that times were bad. Death had not yet visited earth, so they did not starve, but those left hungry in winter were often left wanting until spring. What this caused was the human sylphs and undines highly regarding the sun, praising it when it shined above, but hiding from the dark at night. Only the salamanders, whose fires allowed them to walk outside during the dark without fear, were noticing the moon's jealousy, her rising anger that the sun should be so highly regarded, and she, whose frothing tides created their lives, should be so ignored. One of the salamander named Azazel went to the other groups offering them fire, so they would be able to go without fear into the dark of night and give praise to the moon, like they do the sun. On the coast the next day, Azazel left his fire there as a gift. The humans gathered around it. The sylphs landed from above mesmerized. The undine came out of the water and onto the beach to see, and even though they could not carry it back to their homes in the sea, they were still filled with wonder by it besides. "Look at how it burns," said an undine. "Look at how it cooks our vegetables," a human exclaimed. "It's like looking at the sun, it burns so brightly," a sylph exclaimed. They spent the rest of the day praising the sun for the fire, that burned so much like the sun itself. This only angered the moon further, who introduced death to the world. The humans, the sylphs and the undine, all blamed each other for the calamity that had been bestowed upon them, and wars broke out between them. Azazel and the salamanders just watched in sadness and anger. Death had been bestowed upon their kind as well, though they had tried to warn them. The salamanders disappeared deep into the ground, where the lava flows like rivers through earth. The human, sylph, and undine eventually got tired of their wars, accepting that death was now a part of the earth, and their wars merely destroying any bridges between the three groups. The undine disappeared into the sea. The sylph disappeared into their islands in the sky, far to the north. The hunter needed to stand up and walk. He was about to fall asleep. He needed to move if he was to stay awake. However, his legs and arms were shaky. They did not want to listen to him when he tried to stand up. Outside is the smoking mountain Azazel. The mountain was named Azazel as a remembrance to why the salamander's anger exists to this day. The explosion of molten rock pouring over the earth, destroying the land, the ash poisoning the air and water, is a punishment from the salamanders for what had happened in the past. The disrespect towards the moon, the introduction of death. The hunter, finally able to shakily rise to his feet, stumbled forward out of his seat. The others in the church turned their heads toward him. Their faces had almost predatory looks. The priest merely continued his sermon. "That is why tomorrow our town will sacrifice one member from each tribe of the past that caused the salamanders spite to the mountain. One human, one sylph, and one undine, in order to satiate the anger of the salamanders, so the mountain does not explode its cloud of death upon all of us. The hunter was stumbling in the direction of the door. His mind was jumbled. He thought he heard someone far away mention a sacrifice. He couldn't be sure. The voice sounded so distant. All he knew is that he wanted no part in any sacrifice. The hunter tried walking to the door, but he was just swaying forward, standing still. His body wasn't listening to him. He fell forwards onto the ground, his clouded mind giving into the veil of sleep. The hunter woke up on a small bed in the corner of what appeared to be a jail cell. His head was aching. The hunter reasoned that he had been drugged the day before. Something slipped into the food or drink they gave him. He tried to raise up, to see his surroundings, but his body was still weak. His head screamed as he lifted it up. The hunter battled through the pain. It would have to come eventually. And if his cloudy memories of the day before are anything to go by, he is in danger of being killed. He struggled to lift his head from the pillow. His eyes pressed against each other, the tears forming in the corner of his eyes. It was like knives stabbing into his head. Whatever they drugged him with did a number on him. He staggered over to the bars. They were strong. There was no way to break out. He looked around at the room outside of the bars, and was nearly sobered from his stupor from the surprise of what he saw. Across from him, in a cell like his own, was a woman, lying on a bed. However, from the holes cut in the back of her thin dress she was wearing were wings, like those of a bird, folded around her lithe body. Was the sermon he heard fact? Either way, in front of him was the impossible, a woman with wings. A sylph, that man called them. The hunter may have thought he was dreaming if not for the pain still pulsing at his temples. He almost jumped when he saw one of the wings move. It was so surreal, the large wings stretching upwards from the woman's back, sunlight flooding past the barred windows, reflecting off the white feathers. She raised to a sitting position, raising her slender arms up towards her face. Pushing back her blonde hair, she rubbed sleep from her eyes. She looked almost as shocked as he was when their eyes finally met, her eyes being slightly lighter blue than the blue of her sundress or the blue of the sky seen outside of her cell. Wait a minute, thought the hunter. If there is a woman with wings, then is there an undine as well? The hunter stumbled to the corner of his cell, craning his neck to see farther out of his cell, and gasped once again at what he saw. There was a man in a cell down the hall, lying on his back on the bed, legs fused into a scaly lower half, like that of a fish's body. The man was sweating, mouth agape. He did not seem to be doing well. Openings along the neck, gills, seemed to be working tirelessly as well. Perhaps he was ill from being apart from the sea? The hunter could only guess. He had no idea if being out of water was unhealthy for the undine. When told of them the day before, he regarded them as superstition, but here they were. Now thinking of what was said the day before, the hunter realized he needed to get out of his cell, and soon, if he was to escape being a sacrifice. He looked down the hall the other way and saw a small office, where a guard was sitting. The guard looked his way. The hunter just gave him a nod. There was a box on the floor next to the guard's desk. A strap of the hunter's holster was sticking out. Of course his pistol was taken off of him, and was probably sitting in the box under his holster. He checked the pockets of his pants, and found a single rifle shell therein. He looked at it, turning it in his hands. He quickly glanced around the room, looking for anything that he may be able to use. There was just the bed, and the chamber pot lying under it. He examined the leg of the bed. It was wooden and fastened onto the frame with an iron nail. The hunter grabbed onto the leg and began to pull it. He felt splintering, but he was pulling the nail out with it. "What are you doing?" He turned towards the soft voice to see those blue eyes again, big and shiny as they stared at him with a curious expression. He raised a finger to his mouth, in her direction, with a quiet shh. He looked out of the cell and the guard was still just sitting there. She followed his glance and seemed to understand what he was trying to say, which was, "I don't want to draw this guy's attention." With a final crack, the leg was pulled from the bed. Now it resembled a small club with a short iron point sticking out of the wood where the nail emerged. His plan could commence. The woman was still gazing at him when he walked over to the door of his cell. So he raised his two hands upward, covering his ears. She took the sign and covered her own ears, though not without a look of confusion. He pressed the tip of the rifle shell into the keyhole as firmly as he could. He raised the nail in wood above his head and swung it down onto the shell as a makeshift hammer. There was a loud bang, and the club flew backwards out of the hunter's hand and crashed into the opposite wall. The door to the cell had swung open. The hunter leaned down to pick up a metal rod that was just knocked loose from the frame. The guard was up and rushing out of the room. The hunter emerged from the gunsmoke and the dust that was shaken loose from the walls and swung the pipe, smashing it against the side of the guard's head. The guard crumpled unconscious to the ground. Inside the guard's office, the hunter took his things from the box, pulling the belt and holster on and returning his pistol to its place. He needed to hurry out of there. He knew others would have been alerted by the sound of the rifle shell discharging, and the whole town possibly would be descending upon their jail in order to stop their sacrifices. Sacrifices, he thought, plural. The key to the other cells was lying on the desk. He would not normally try to interfere with others or the workings of their town that he was no part of, but he could feel those clear blue eyes glancing at him from the cell behind him. Her and the Undine, that would be killed if he left them. The town would probably use one of their own in his stead as a sacrifice if he left. They were probably already prepared to do so before he arrived. But they did choose me, and so they forced my involvement. All of these thoughts jumbled around the hunter's head in mere seconds as he reached for the keys on the table. He already knew what he had to do. The door to the sylph's cell was thrown open, and she stumbled out of her cell out of either reluctance or weakness. The hunter did not know how long she was kept in the cell by the town. She followed him over to the Undine's cell as the hunter opened it as well. He and the sylph pulled at his arms to get him to raise, the hunter not knowing how the Undine would run on land with that fish tail. But they got him to his feet, and his fish tail was surprisingly flexible, the scales undulating as the tail shook from one side to the other to push him forward, like the writhing movements of a snake. The group ran towards the door, and the hunter drew his pistol with one hand as he kicked the door open. There were shocked faces of villagers outside the jail peering at them, but as long as they stayed out of the way, the hunter wasn't bothered by them. His car was, thankfully, still in the same place in the middle of town. It seemed that, just like the past few towns, the village had no idea what the car was or how to use it, or they just had no interest in them. Either way, they had left the car alone, and that was their goal, the hunter pushing them in its direction. The bell on that tower began ringing again, and the hunter knew what that would bring. The citizens began to once again walk towards the building with the bell, the hunter trying his best to navigate towards his car while trying to carry in one arm an Undine who seemed ill or exhausted to the point where he could fall at any moment. Maybe trying to escape together was a mistake, unknown consequences of that question filling the hunter with anxiety. The villagers were giving them a wide berth, though at the same time the street seemed to be covered with people on both sides of the three escaped inmates. There would be sacrifices. They could do naught but to push forward towards the vehicle anyway. As soon as we reach my car up ahead, we'll be able to speed out of here. We just have to all jump into my car. You see it ahead? You mean the metal chariot? The Undine's face is sickly pale as he asked this. The hunter answered his question with a nod of his head. The Undine laughed for a moment, a strained laugh that seemed to be a product more of nervousness than of amusement, and a laugh that the Undine's body struggled to produce. I thought I may have been hallucinating that. The sylph who was holding the Undine up by his arm on the other side shot the hunter a worried glance at the Undine's words, but whatever anxiety she had would betray her only in that one glance. She still firmly held the Undine's arm, pushing him and thusly the group quickly but cautiously towards the car. There was a tension in the air, the variety of which the hunter knew too well. The villagers and their leaders from the building with the bell were not going to let them leave without a fight. The inmates likewise would not stay to be sacrificed without a fight. Both sides knew a fight was coming, just not when it would break out. The hunter knew that the closer they were to his car when the fight broke out, the better. It was their ticket out of there. The tension was finally broken in the form of an arrow shot at them from a building to the side, the metal tip cutting through apprehension on both sides. The arrow narrowly missed the hunter's head, hitting the Undine in his shoulder. The Undine staggered backward due to the shock of being hit, pushing the hunter to the side but pulling the sylph down with him. The hunter could be slowed by them no longer. He drew his pistol, firing a shot in the direction of the archer. He ran forward, shooting a warning shot in either direction. The large booming sound as each bullet discharged seemed to startle the citizens, who were pushed backwards out of fear from the sound of them. Maybe they had never seen a pistol before, and bows were their primary ranged weapon. Either way, the hunter was now sprinting, and his path to the car was basically unblocked. He reached the car in no time at all, quickly started it and pulled it out onto the street. The hunter saw the undine and the sylph lying in the street out of his rearview mirror. He quickly U-turned the car, pulling it beside the man of the sea and the woman of the air. The undine still had that arrow jammed into his shoulder. He pulled it out with one yank, and practically fell into the back of the car, between some boxes, while the sylph paused for a moment of hesitation before sitting in the passenger seat. The hunter was speeding back onto the road away from the town before she even had time to shut the door behind her. There was a clamor of people behind those in the car, and arrows shot in their direction, but once in the car it was a straight shoot out of town. No villager seemed brave enough to step in front of the vehicle to challenge it. The hunter was free, and back on the road. His short dark hair was in a flurry from the wind, but unlike any time before he was joined by another's flurry of hair. The sylph's long hair being blown wildly by the wind, pouring into the hoodless car as it sped along the road, and for a moment the hunter believed he saw a smile somewhere within that dancing gold, but he was unsure.